As I was reading the story for this week, the story that Amy just read, a very familiar story to us, I was reminded of some of my time in the military. I spent 6 years in the Army, and part of that was spent at Fort Benning, Georgia. And I was going through the officer advanced course, kind of a training to learn about what it meant to be an officer, some of the skills we needed. And one of the primary skills I was learning was how to write what are called operations orders, kind of a plan once you're given a mission, and there's a whole series of 5 paragraphs you have to write in descriptions of what and how you're going to execute a particular mission. But what I was thinking about in particular was one of my instructors. He had a phrase that he used very often when he would critique, and he definitely critiqued what we would present. He would say this: there are precise words that are to be used precisely. He spoke of precise words used precisely. He said, you can't simply take 3 words, for example, screen, guard, and cover, which were different kinds of missions. They sound similar, they look kind of similar, but they have very different things. Or are you occupying, or are you defending, or are you securing, or are you seizing? Now, at first glance, a lot of those words sound similar, and it's irrelevant what exactly the difference is between those. But he said you have to use precise words precisely. And I was thinking about that because there is a man in the story today who has a question, and he wants to be clear on the mission. He wants to know precisely what does a particular word mean. Now, this is a familiar story. As you were listening, this is one of the ones that most people are familiar with. You've maybe heard it dozens of times, this story that Jesus tells that we often refer to as the Good Samaritan. And we'll talk a little bit later about that particular phrase, but I want to invite you to hear it again, to reconsider what Jesus is saying, what he is telling us, and who he is calling to be. So it's found in the Gospel of Luke. We have 4 stories of Jesus, 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This story is found only in Luke. And so Luke tells this story, and what's happened right before is Jesus' followers have gone out on a mission, and there's this experience of the presence of the kingdom of God. And then our story for today begins with what it refers to as an expert in the law. Some translations refer to him as a lawyer or a scribe. This is simply someone who devoted their lives to studying the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the commandments of God, who studied those, what they meant, and how to apply them. So he comes to Jesus and he asks him a question. What must I do to inherit eternal life? He's asking him a question about enjoying the blessings of God. It's a question about, how do I live if I want to enjoy God's blessing? He's not asking about earning salvation, but what he's asking about, what does it look like to live a life that's pleasing to God? And so Jesus does what Jesus so often does. He responds to a question with a question. And he says to the man, he says, what is written in the law? How do you read it? He knows he's an expert in the law. He knows the man knows the answer. He says, well, you're the expert in the law. You're the scribe. What do you say? How do you read it? And the man responds, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. He quotes the book of Deuteronomy, part of what is known as the Shema, this prayer that Jewish people would say twice a day, every day. So he knew this phrase. He said, that's it. And then love your neighbor as yourself, which comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18. And he puts these 2 together, which was not uncommon. In fact, it was very common in those days to take these 2 commands about loving God and loving neighbor and put them together and say, this sums up what God calls us to do. That these 2 are linked together, that our love for God in part is expressed in our love for our neighbor. And this is where the question of precise terms used precisely comes in. Because he said, well, the law calls me to love my neighbor. And he says, well, but I got a question for you, Jesus. Who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? It says maybe seeking to justify himself, maybe pointing out the people that Jesus has been with. But the point is, he's asking the question when he says, who is my neighbor? He's asking, well, who do I have to love? In some sense, the question is, who is not my neighbor? Who doesn't deserve my love? Or who don't I need to expend my energy to love? And Jesus answers him. And Jesus answers as he often does, not with a lecture, not with 3 points, but he tells a story. He tells a story and he says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He doesn't tell us who the man is. He said, just imagine a man. And you can imagine the people sitting around because Jesus is probably not alone at this moment. It's probably not just him and this scribe. There's a group of followers there and they're listening. They want to know, what's Jesus going to say? And so he starts off and he says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He invites them to begin to enter in. And maybe at this point, you're sitting in the crowd and you're thinking, okay, I've done that trip before. Maybe I'm that man. I'm going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And down is both a literal and figurative. Jerusalem sits about 3,000 feet above Jericho, about 18 miles. So it's descending 200 feet every mile. It's this long descent through rough, rocky terrain, hills, but very barren. And he's headed down this road that was notably treacherous and often beset by bandits, and that's exactly what happens. It says, he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And so at that point, maybe you're listening to the story and you're thinking, oh, I can imagine what that must be like. Maybe I've never been robbed, never I've been beaten, but I can put myself in those shoes of this happening to me on this treacherous road where someone has beat me and I'm laying there and I'm laying half dead and I'm wondering what's going to happen. How am I going to get out of this? Am I going to get out of it? Or am I going to simply die here by the side of the road? But then Jesus shifts the story to a different perspective. We're no longer the man who was beaten, but he tells us something. He says a priest happened to be going down the same road. So a priest, one of these men who worked in the temple and assisted with sacrifices, who was a stand-in between God and people. And this priest is coming down the road. And when he saw the man, so he sees him, he passed by on the other side. And so we're listening to the story and say, okay, what's going on here? But then it says, so to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. A Levite is simply a priestly assistant. They were come from the same family, but they didn't have all the same responsibilities that a priest did. But these were religious folks who were responsible for the religious practices. So we see them. And one of the questions as we're listening to the story, but why did they do that? Why didn't they stop? And there are lots of conjectures about why they may not have stopped. But one of the things we have to notice in the story is Jesus doesn't tell us why they didn't stop. He's not concerned with explaining why they didn't stop. The point of the story is they did not stop. They passed by on the other side. Some people suggest, well, they were worried about ritual purity. A couple things to notice. Amy Jill Levine, a Jewish scholar, points out they're leaving Jerusalem, which means they've already done the religious acts, so any purity issues are irrelevant. More importantly than that, the law commands you and says when there is life in danger, the laws are suspended. They walk by, they don't know, because the thinking is, well, they were concerned about being defiled by a corpse. First of all, how do they know he's actually dead? So, and second of all, if he is dead, the law requires that you stop and you bury a body. That's a violation of the law to not take care of a dead body. It's also a violation of the law to not take care of someone in need. So whether he was dead or not dead, they had an obligation to stop and to do something about it. We don't know why they didn't. Maybe they were scared. I mean, I can imagine if I were walking down a road and I see some guy who's been beaten up, I'm thinking, are the guys who did this still hanging around? Maybe I don't want to stop and help. And I'm going to pass on by. Regardless, we don't know why they stopped. The point Jesus is making is they did not stop. And then we come and he begins and he tells about a third figure. So we've had two. We've had a priest and we've had a Levite, and now we get a third. And this is a common storytelling technique. Dates back thousands of years, these sets of three. Most of us probably grew up with stories with sets of three. For example, Three Little Pigs, right? And how do most of those stories go? The first two fail, and the third one succeeds. So you got the Three Little Pigs, the house of straw, the house of sticks, and then the house with bricks, and that's the guy who does it right. Or Goldilocks. You got Papa Bear's food, Mama Bear's food, and bed and chair and all that. And then finally we get to Baby Bear, and those are just right. So now in the story, and this is not simply something that Grimm's fairy tales invented or modern, it was something in ancient storytelling too. So you as a listener sitting and listening to it, hear these stories being told, and you said, priest didn't do it, Levi didn't do it. Whoever comes along next is going to be the person who does what they're supposed to do. And you might be expecting, remember this is a Jewish audience, that in storytelling of those days, there was kind of that trope, that way of telling the story. It would often be a priest, a Levite, and an Israelite. So a lay person. So you can imagine it's like there's a bishop and a pastor and then just somebody from the congregation. And so here's this way of looking at it. And so you're sitting here saying, oh, here comes the Israelite, going to do the right thing. But Jesus says, but a Samaritan. Which at this point, the audience would start to get a little uncomfortable. Now, there's a long, complicated history between the Jews and the Samaritans. It deals with theology, it deals with lineage, and it's not necessary to know all of those details. So I'm not going to bore you with those. I'm not going to give you a bunch of... But the point, one of the things we want to understand is they didn't get along very well. There were bad feelings. Now, occasionally there were some good things said about it, but essentially we get the idea that the majority of the people had bad feelings about Samaritan. They were seen as not just strangers, but as enemies. So now you are listening to this story Jesus is telling. Maybe you're the scribe, maybe you're sitting in the crowd. And Jesus is telling this story, and we say the priest fails, the Levite fails, and now a Samaritan comes along. We think, uh-oh, what's going on? And we're maybe feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe we're worrying about, what is this Jesus going to say about this Samaritan? And we're influenced, we've heard the story enough, or even if we've never heard the story, our culture is filled with references to the Good Samaritan. There are hospitals called the Good Samaritan. There's a RV organization, an organization of trucks, the Good Sam Club. You see these little stickers. And we put these two together and we assume that a Good Samaritan, but that's not how the original hearers would have heard it. They wouldn't think Good Samaritan. They wouldn't think any Samaritans are good. In fact, even that language of Good Samaritan is a little bit pejorative. And I don't really like using it for the story because it suggests the rest of the Samaritans are bad. Well, we got the Good Samaritan. So what does the Samaritan do? The Samaritan comes along. And it says he traveled by to where the man was. He saw him, just like the first two. He sees him, but he does something different. It says he took pity on him. He had compassion. He was moved. He saw this man in trouble, and something happened. And so he goes to him. He bandages his wounds. He pours oil and wine on them as a disinfectant, as a cleanser. He takes the man. He puts him on his own donkey. He takes him to an inn to take care of him. And the next day, so he spends the night with the man. And the next day he gives him 2 denarii, which is probably a couple days' wages, enough to cover a week or 2 weeks in the inn. He gives these to the innkeeper and he says, look after him. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. It's as if he pulls out his credit card and hands it to the innkeeper and says, here, take care of him. Whatever you need, I'm going to take care of it. We're thinking, wow, this guy has expended his own, he's gone way above and beyond. We might think, what would be enough? Oh, to stop and kind of check on the guy. Are you okay? When I get to the next town, I'll call somebody, right? I'll send someone back to help you. Or maybe you patch him up a little bit and say, well, good luck. I saw a caravan back there. They're going to bring you farther along. Or maybe you pick him up and you put him on your donkey and you drop him off at the inn and you say, hey, I found this guy by the side of the road. Take care of him, would you? And you move on. The Samaritan expends his resources. He expends his time. He pours out generosity on this man. He goes above and beyond. And so having told this story, then Jesus asks the question, which of these do you think was a neighbor? What was the original question? Who is my neighbor? Jesus tells a story to answer the question, but then ends the story with the question, who was a neighbor? And the scribe, you can imagine he's getting a little fidgety, feels a little bit caught. He said, well, it was the guy who had mercy on him. You notice he can't even bring himself to say the Samaritan. It's just, oh, the one who had mercy on him. That was the good neighbor. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. Now on the surface, this is where it gets a little tricky. On the surface, it sounds like maybe just an example story. An example of, well, we should take care of people who are in trouble. We should be a good neighbor. But there's a detail in the story that makes me think it's a little more than that. There's nothing wrong with that part of the story. But Jesus used a Samaritan for a reason. He didn't just say, he could have said there was a priest, a Levite, and an Israelite. Go and be like that Israelite. He says, go and be like that Samaritan. Because why? Because what was the question the scribe asked to begin? Who is my neighbor? Or who is not my neighbor? To put it better. What was the scribe wanting to do? He was wanting to put limits on it. And Jesus blows away the idea of limits and says, there are no limits on this. We don't get to say when we have loved enough, nor are we allowed to choose who we love. In a sense, what Jesus is saying is, there are these two commands, and you said those are the right things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus is saying, are you defined by those commands? Is your character, your being, are you shaped by who those are? He's asking, what is our identity? And as followers of Jesus, our identity is found in Jesus Christ. That's the one in whom we live and move and have our being. We don't just have a relationship with him, we live inside of him and he lives inside of us. And Jesus, in some sense, lives out this story. St. Augustine, one of the early interpreters of this, described it as an allegory. And he says, we're the people who are by the side of the road. And Jesus comes along and bandages us up. Now, I don't think that's what Jesus was meant by the original story. But you see how that works. He's inviting us to see that and to see what it looks like. We see Jesus in that we often are laying beside the road. Jesus comes along and he picks us up and he expends massive amounts of resources. We call that overwhelming grace. And he takes care of us and he doesn't give up on us. And we're invited to participate in that same life. And the participation in the life of Jesus is to put love into action. Like Martin Luther King Jr. in one of his sermons about the mountaintop, he talks about this parable. And he asks a good question. He says, one question we may ask is, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? Because that may be the question that's going on. If I stop and help this man, what will happen to me? But what King says is the better question is, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? Now, this isn't earning our salvation. It's describing life with God. It's not doing good on our own, but it's rooted in a relationship with God. That our love for God is expressed in love for neighbors. And it's about saying, who is my neighbor? It's someone we see in need. Now, there are absolutely no shortage of people who are in need, right? If we simply say a neighbor is anyone we see who is in need, we see that all the time. And so it requires wisdom. It requires wisdom of how we live this out. And the story is called to shape our character. The story doesn't necessarily tell us what to do in every circumstance. but it encouraged us to form an identity that doesn't set boundaries about who my neighbor is. So I want to consider some of those. Now go back to the story again before I begin. When Jesus tells the story, he introduces a Samaritan. And when he introduces the Samaritan as the hero of the story, if you will, it's fair to assume that the people in the crowd started to squirm a little bit, started to get a little uncomfortable, started to wonder about what Jesus was saying and where is he going with this, because I don't like this. This is a warning. I'm going to say some things right now, and they may make you feel a little uncomfortable. You might start to squirm a little bit, but I want you to listen, because that's what Jesus invited. I want you to listen and simply consider. And so a couple examples. One is this, Alan Verhey, who's a medical ethicist, uses the parable of the Good Samaritan to talk about compassion in the medical field. And what he talks about is scarcity in the medical field. Now, we might not think of scarcity necessarily here in the United States where there's doctor offices everywhere, but the truth is, even here in the United States, there are limited resources for medical care. How many of you waited months sometimes to see a doctor? Or at the flip side of that, how many have been told you need a procedure or medication and then they tell you how much it's going to cost and there's a scarcity all of a sudden in your checkbook because you're deciding whether or not to pay for it? Or consider what happens if you don't have insurance and you have a catastrophic event. And so what Verhey asks is, how do we show compassion? Imagine the Samaritan. The Samaritan comes along, he finds this man alongside the road. Think of all those resources he put out, all that time and effort he gave. What happens if the next day he travels and there's another guy on the road? Because this is a notorious, dangerous road. He travels down, there's another guy. It's like, oh. And then the next day there's another guy. And then the next day there's 3 guys alongside the road. Can he keep it up? Probably not. It can become overwhelming, just like it can become overwhelming for us. That when we see the needs, it is. And so maybe what Verhey suggests is he begins to have a different kind of look. Maybe as the good neighbor, he begins to think about public policy. Well, if I keep finding all these guys robbed alongside the road, maybe the problem is that we need some patrols along the road to keep the people safe. Maybe we need to set up a system where there are innkeepers who can take care of these people so I don't have to keep doing that. But what he makes the point at the end is the story doesn't tell us the policy about whatever it is as we consider even in our modern day. How do we deal with people who have inadequate medical care, who don't have access to resources? How do we deal with that? You can't read the parable here and just say, oh, I've got the policy solution. But what you can do is when you're thinking about the policy, pay attention to the story. What might it suggest? How do I show love for my neighbor? Could it be an advocacy? It could be practical help. It could be the way I vote. There's something, but we keep that story in our mind saying, one of my fundamental identities as a follower of Jesus is to love my neighbor. And there are no boundaries on who my neighbor is. So as I process the medical world in the United States of America, I have to think, how do I show love for my neighbor in my interactions with that? Maybe it's advocating, maybe it's writing to a senator, maybe it's participating in a co-op, whatever it is, I don't know, but we have to go back and we say, that's the place we started with that story. Second example might be, as we see the story, we saw the priest and the Levite, and they're walking down the road, and they pass by on the other side. In other words, they kind of do one of these, right? I know I've done that a few times. You may not have ever done that, where there's something that's a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe it's a person on the road, or maybe it's something on the news. Something going on, and we avert our eyes because it's overwhelming. We're not sure what to do with it. I think of the wars and atrocities going on around the world right now. We think of, for example, a conflict in Gaza. And I realize it's a complex situation. There's a lot of political things going on. But a reality, a fact of that situation is that in Gaza over the last 2 years, there have been thousands of children killed and hundreds of thousands of children displaced. Many more who've been wounded both physically and emotionally by the war going on. And we may have differing ideas about the politics and who's right and who's wrong in that. But as I hear this story and what Jesus tells us, I don't think I can say they deserve it. I can say, well, they're part of Hamas. But the question is, they are my neighbor too. No matter what their background is, no matter what's gone on, they are my neighbor. So what will I do? How will I respond in love? Jesus doesn't spell that out in this story. But what he does tell us is, they're your neighbor. As are the Israeli Defense Forces. They're your neighbor too. So how do you love them? How do you demonstrate love and care for them? Maybe it's the issue of abortion. We recognize the unborn is my neighbor. The mother in need, the mother in crisis is my neighbor. I don't get to come up with a definition. I don't get to put them outside of the category of neighbor by using some other terminology. They are my neighbor, so I have to ask my question, how do I care for them? What is Jesus calling me to do? Jesus doesn't spell it out in the story. But he does say the fundamental identity we have is one that looks and says there are no boundaries on who my neighbor is, and I'm called to make a difference. I'm called to do something about it, and I need wisdom to do that. Category 4, immigrants. Yeah, I'm going there. You're going to get uncomfortable. But this isn't about the politics of the U.S. immigration system, which is a mess. And I think both political parties would agree with that. There's no doubt about that. But the question I want to ask is, when we're considering people who have entered this country illegally, whether they are a gang member or someone who has lived here for 20 years, and in that time, the only law they have broken is they live here illegally, and they've raised a family, they've worked, they've contributed to the economy, we have to ask ourselves, how do I think of them as my neighbor? What does it look like for me to demonstrate love for them? And even sometimes that language, I don't even like love for them as if they're the other. And Jesus is saying there are no others. They're neighbors. And so as we look at people, we often jump to categorizing based on illegal, legal, and there's all these things that we need to, they're infecting our country, whatever the cases are. Jesus says, no, what I want you to see is they are your neighbors. And what God wants you to do, the kind of shape and form people you do, is you are called to love them. Does that give us a policy solution? Absolutely not. And we may even come to different places on what that policy may be. But the starting place isn't what the Constitution says. The starting place isn't what the law says. The starting place isn't any one of those. The starting place are the words of Jesus to say, love your neighbor. And then you filter everything through that. And if you come to a solution and it doesn't look like loving your neighbor, it stays out. So we have to keep this story in mind as we discuss it, as we're having conversations with our neighbor, as we're fighting about it on Facebook or whatever it is you're doing, as you're writing to your senator or congressman, whatever it is you're doing, that story has to be in the front of your mind. That story has to be the filter through which your words and your thoughts pass to say you are called to love your neighbor as yourself. It also says something about racism. We can talk about that. But the point is, there are no boundaries, no limits on love. And so we're invited to hear this story and begin to say, Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And he tells the story to make us uncomfortable. He tells us a story to say that loving your neighbor looks like action. It looks like mercy and compassion, and then doing something out of that. What that action is, requires wisdom. I can't tell all of you what to do in a precise situation. I don't know what people you are encountering in your daily life. I don't know what situations you're seeing. And I also know that we all have limited resources. And I know that because none of us is God and he alone has unlimited resources. If some of you have unlimited resources, come and see me after the service, okay? Because I can find some use for those. We all have limited resources. We have limited time. We have limited money. We have limited mental energy. We have limited emotional energy. We are limited in all those things. So the reality is we can't help every single person that we see. Whether it's the person standing on the corner of 31 in the exit ramp, or it's a child in Gaza, or it's an unborn child, any one of those, or the immigrant in Arizona, whatever it is, we can't help every single one of those. But what we can do is filter our thoughts and our considerations through the picture of love. What we can do is do something for somebody. Because Jesus says, go and do likewise. He doesn't say just go and have a good opinion about your neighbor. We could do that. It's like we could all walk out of here safely today. Oh, I love my neighbor. Then what have you done for them? Jesus would ask. What have you done for them? Is it easy? Nope. And that's why this story is an identity shaping thing. It's shaping us to look like Jesus. And we need his help to do that. We need the help of Jesus to see who our neighbor is. We need the help of Jesus to break down the walls and the barriers, the prejudices, all the ideas we've concocted and been fed to us throughout our life. We need Jesus to break those down. And then we need Jesus to give us wisdom to know who to help. We need Jesus to give us wisdom to know how to help. We need Jesus to give us that love when helping the neighbor gets hard and difficult. When the neighbor is challenging, when they test us, when they push us. And so I would invite us to hear this story. Hear the story that Jesus tells and allow it to shape our identity. Shape who we are as people living in Jesus, as people whose Jesus lives inside of us, as people who do not place boundaries on who we think of as our neighbor, and we are called to love. May we be the people who find the hurting and the broken alongside the road wherever they may be. And may we be the people who, like Jesus, binds them up and cares for them with compassion and mercy. May we be the neighbors that we have called to be. Amen.